What's going on, everybody? Sam Shapiro back here with more of your Heat latest on FanArc. Talks of Andrew Wiggins going to LA have now resurfaced ahead of training camp. We're going to get into that and more here on this episode of your Heat latest. But don't forget to drop a like on this video and, of course, subscribe to our channel. Now, before we were kind of discussing these talks involving Andrew Wiggins potentially going to the Lakers, a lot of this I felt like was, hypotheticals, died down trade talks, or at least we weren't going to see any movement, at least in towards the tip-off of the regular season. But now it's being confirmed, or at least reported by Evan Siddery. The Heat and the Lakers have reopened discussions on a potential Andrew Wiggins trade ahead of training camp. The Lakers very open to moving Dalton Connect alongside necessary expiring salary, but Miami making it very clear that they want a first-round pick in this deal. So compared to some of the mock trades I was talking about earlier just a few days ago, it seemed like Miami wanting Rui Hachimura, Connect, and some first-round picks, as well as some of that necessary expiring salary in kind of a package as well. But now it almost kind of seems like from these reports that Hachimura not even needing to be part of that deal, Miami kind of just open to really just bringing in a guy like Connect 4 and a first-round draft asset in the mix. So I think it's very interesting. This move to me kind of screams Miami ultimately really looking for a reset overhaul, just because they maybe don't think with the current roster we have, we're going to really be able to make a big postseason push, maybe, really making our way into the Eastern Conference Finals and then potentially punching another ticket to, that championship bout with whichever Western Conference foe Miami might be up against. But it almost kind of seems like, based on these reports, Miami kind of trying to see what future assets they could acquire to help maybe build around acquiring another superstar like a Kevin Durant or a Giannis Antetokounmpo that could be eligible to be the next superstar for Miami in maybe seasons to come. I don't necessarily think there's enough writing on the wall for that entirely to be the exact formula right now, but I definitely think that's kind of what these trade reports now, I guess, resuming official trade talks for potentially dealing Andrew Wiggins to the Lakers resurfacing, kind of scream rebuild to me just a little bit. But it'll be curious to see how Miami kind of navigates some of the other assets they have if they decide to keep guys like Bam and Tyler, even if they have to fork them over a decent amount of money, because in the grand scheme of things, they then might not be able to afford a high-level superstar necessarily, at least to a long-term contract. Maybe they'd be willing to kind of see what deal could be available, like the Rockets kind of have for Kevin Durant right now, but only time will tell, and we'll just have to wait and see if Miami decides to go all in on a potential, more of a rebuild type of route and dealing away assets like Wiggins before even really kind of giving him a chance to kind of play in the regular season. I want to at least see how he's going to play in the first couple of months of play, but Miami also maybe not wanting to risk that because the whole Terry Rozier experiment didn't work, and that on top of the federal investigation really, I feel like, has kind of diminished his value entirely. So it seems like Miami not necessarily so high on taking a risk on Wiggins, at least at this point in time, if they're potentially talking about a trade involving just Dalton Connect and a first-round draft asset. So drop in the comments what you think Miami's ultimately going to do, if they'll decide to stick with Wiggins going into the tip-off of the regular season, or if they'll just decide to get some future, not just Dalton Connect, but a solid first-round pick that they could potentially use to draft another star, hopefully down the line. I mean, I think that's kind of what the hope is for any first-round pick that a team would acquire in a trade like that. But another asset that I think that Miami is going to really try to see if they play out is going to be obviously Norman Powell, the trade of the offseason for Miami. And I think that now kind of more than ever, with especially these talks with Wiggins going on, the significance of how Powell's play starting out the season is going to be very significant. I think in the first month of play, there's going to be a lot of speculation on if he should stay or go, depending on how he plays in those games. And I just think that if he kind of comes out and he's not really at least performing to the career clip that he's capable of playing, which is at least 13 to 15 points per game, then people are going to be kind of not so high and mighty on riding the Norman Powell train for at least the rest of the regular season. And I wouldn't be surprised if people are kind of hoping that he ultimately leaves Miami and doesn't stick around for a potential extension. However, I think if he picks up where he left off in LA with the Clippers, averaging around 20 points per game on some pretty efficient shooting, I think Miami is definitely going to want to keep him as a rotational guy, potentially a long-term starter that could really continue to develop into his career even more. I really see both sides potentially playing out, but because of how high Miami is on him and what he's going to contribute to Miami's overall success, I kind of lean towards more him being an efficient scorer and a very solid shooter for Miami going into this season, despite winning, where the games, whether they fall in the win or loss column for South Beach. I definitely think Powell, quite honestly, should get a little bit more time than a month. If, he comes into that first month to play and he is kind of shaking off some rust a little bit. Teams always look a little bit different when they're in a new environment, playing with new players under a new coaching staff. And I think Spoelstra very supportive of him, of Powell really coming in here and trying to add some depth to Miami's roster. So I'm hopeful that even if Powell is kind of shaking off some rust for about the first month or two, that ultimately he can find his footing, and that the people that are as excited about him now coming in will continue to be excited because of what he's able to do for the overall success of the team. And now moving over to some another interesting kind of Miami Heat news, so to speak. This all kind of entered, I feel like, Miami Heat just conversation really, and surrounding the history of the team when LeBron, D. Wade, Bosh, and Melo were recognized by the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame for their Olympic runs. And it was just interesting because the idea of there potentially being a big four, kind of, that also became a conversation. And I found that to be very, quite honestly, I never knew that to begin with, that there could have potentially been a big four in Miami with Carmelo Anthony joining Dwayne Wade, Chris Bosh, and LeBron James in those conversations. And it was very interesting also to kind of see what he had to say in terms of, maybe making that team come to fruition. Melo, very, again, just was exciting to see, one, that the idea of it even being entertained in the first place was even there, but two, it was just, I wouldn't say Melo really entertained it. I think more of LeBron and Wade, who are pretty friendly with Melo, would be, I think, just would marvel over the fact that could even be a possibility of bringing a roster together like that. But what Melo had to say in terms of creating a big four with LeBron, Wade, and Bosh, he ultimately didn't want to go through with it because he didn't want to necessarily be the option. He said, quote, "Imagine me at 23, 24 years old being the fourth option on a team where I'm leading my team every single, or when rather he was leading the Denver Nuggets prior to that every single year. Like, I'm finding my way in this league, and you don't want me to leave that to go be a fourth option. I don't know how mentally I was going to do that. So I was like, hell no, I can't be that fourth." And quite honestly, part of me is also kind of like, I think if he had decided to be the fourth, would Miami have won more championships if the big four maybe came to be? Well, considering that young Melo he pretty much is saying in this quote that he wanted to be a main option, a main kind of focal piece in the team's overall success, I don't necessarily know if he would have been able to take that. Quite honestly, his ego could have kind of gotten in the way. And I mean, LeBron obviously was the most talented player in that Miami Heat big three, but it was also Dwayne Wade's franchise. So I feel like the two of them kind of led the charge, and then Bosh was kind of there as the third option. So I think Melo, coming from an environment like Denver, wouldn't have wanted to kind of get in the mix in terms of clearly wouldn't have wanted to get in the mix of the hierarchy of that, would have probably wanted to take some clutch last minute shots and tried to be there to help the team kind of get over the hump in those clutch situations. So trying to see how all four egos would have meshed together would have been very interesting to see, and quite honestly could have been detrimental to this team really going to 4 finals in a row and then only winning 2 out of those 4 finals. So drop in the comments if you think the big 4 maybe could have been more successful than the big 3, but based on Melo's response there, I think the egos would have clashed a little bit, and I don't necessarily think it would have worked out for the best. So I'm happy Melo got to go back home to the Knicks and lose to us in the grand scheme of things and not really be able to get New York over the hump. But it was exciting to see him play some of those games in the Garden and, kind of really develop that next part of his career. But talking about clutch plays, yesterday marked the 5-year anniversary of the Bam Adebayo block in the Disney Bubble Eastern Conference Finals. And quite honestly, just thinking that play was 5 years ago already, quite honestly, is kind of unbelievable. September 15th, 2020, exactly 5 years ago yesterday, the Miami Heat edged out the Boston Celtics in Game 1 of that Disney Bubble Eastern Conference Finals. Game 1, 117 to 114 in overtime. Bam Adebayo's iconic block on Jason Tatum sealed the deal. And I don't remember where you guys were. Drop in the comments if you remember where you were, what you were doing when this play transpired, if you were watching it live, because I remember exactly where I was watching this. I was a senior in college watching the game with my brother in Ithaca, New York. And I remember absolutely freaking out watching this game. I mean, toe-to-toe, back and forth. Both teams were extremely competitive with one another. And ultimately, Miami's big rally in the fourth quarter was kind of what put them in the position to ultimately do this. I mean, their first and third quarters in this game, extremely weak in the grand scheme of things, scoring 18 and 16 respectively, but then pushing out a strong 37-point second quarter and then a 35-point fourth quarter really put them in the position to hang tight with this tough Celtics team. And I mean, I just remember watching that play, seeing Tatum drive to the basket, thinking he was honestly going to seal the deal with that layup. And when I initially watched the play, I thought Bam's hand was in the actual rim. And I quite honestly was afraid they were going to call a goaltend, but it was so unbelievably close. I remember screaming on the top of my lungs, freaking out over this block. Not to even exaggerate, in terms of watching a defensive performance live, might have been the best block I'd ever seen on a broadcast televised game live, behind the LeBron James 2016 NBA Finals block, because I mean that's one of the greatest blocks in NBA history. But this block, just being a Heat fan in such a unique situation, NBA playoff basketball in September. I mean, hopefully we'll never have to experience that again, not because it was bad basketball, but because of what the state of the world was in and why we were watching the NBA playoffs in the middle of the fall. But it was just, it's one of the most iconic defensive plays I've ever watched. And quite honestly, I can't blame Miami for kind of keeping hands off of even considering trading Bam Adebayo because of that defensive play. There are very few players in the NBA that can make tough plays like that. And quite honestly, I think if you put on 95% of the other power forwards or centers on Tatum on that play, that's a game-winning poster and Miami loses. So again, I can't believe it's been 5 years since that iconic block, and it's kind of nice to sit here and celebrate how it's still one of the most iconic defensive plays in Miami Heat history. Well, that's going to do it for today's episode of your Heat Latest here on FanArc. Don't forget to drop a like on this video and, of course, subscribe to our channel for great daily content, all pertaining to your Miami Heat. Thanks so much for joining us this Tuesday. I'm Sam Shapiro. Have a great day.